a little bit about CASP. We are a nonprofit trade association of autism service provider organizations, not individuals, but organizations that have demonstrated a commitment to promoting and delivering evidence-based services for autism. We develop and promote standards of care for the delivery of ABA for the treatment of autism at both the individual level and at the organizational level. At the individual practitioner level, we publish the ABA practice guidelines, and at the organization level through our nonprofit accrediting subsidiary, the Autism Commission on Quality, who sets standards at the organizational level and accredits those organizations who have met those standards. We also facilitate collaboration and information sharing among our member organizations to elevate the operational efficiency, but also the quality of services being delivered to our families. And we advocate on behalf of the provider at the state and federal level. But most importantly, like many of you, I am an autism parent. And I wanted to, if possible, and this may be a total fail, but I'd like to try to gather a little bit information about who is on this call. And we can do that in one of two ways. If you are on your laptop, just go to www.menti.com and enter in the code that's on the screen. Alternatively, if you've got your phones handy, you can just scan this QR code and it'll take you to a series of questions. So I'll just let everybody have a few minutes to get that going, and then we'll go to the next slide and see who's on the call. So the first question I wanted to ask is, what is your relationship to the autism community? Are you an individual with autism? Are you a parent or guardian of an autistic individual? Are you an autism service provider, an autism advocate, or are you attending in some other capacity? And you can put more than one answer there if you'd like. All right, it's working. Look at that. We got at least 4 people.
That's when I first brought it brought up a different question, but now I have the right question up. So.
All right. Well, this is kind of cool. I'm excited. So anyway, it looks like at least half of us or more are parents or guardians of an autistic individual. And the next big section is the other category. All right, so the next question is, if you are the parent or guardian of an autistic individual, how old are they? Are they less than 5, 5 to 15, 15 to 21, or are you the parent of or guardian of an adult on the spectrum? All right, so as of now, it looks like we're equally split between those who are parents or guardians of kids less than 5 or 5 to 15. And then one more question is, where are you coming in from? Kansas, Missouri, or another state? All right, looks like of the 7 people that are responding, we're all Kansans, so okay. All right, well, thank you for humoring me with that. Again, I am an autism dad. My daughter was diagnosed with autism in 2001. And at that time, she was diagnosed at KU. And what they recommended primarily was that she receive applied behavior analysis, as well as speech and occupational therapy. But at that time, no state in the United States was required to cover ABA. For that matter, and was the case with us, they wouldn't cover any therapy that was prescribed if it was prescribed for the purposes of treating the core deficits of autism. But we were fortunate, and I recognize that my family is very fortunate that we were able to find a way to pay for her therapy out of pocket. And what was prescribed for her individualized prescription was 30 hours of applied behavior analysis per week. She received that for 3 years. The upshot of that was that she was able to mainstream in regular education without an aid by the first grade. And if you look at the data on the efficacy of applied behavior analysis, that's not unusual at all. In fact, about 50% of individuals diagnosed with autism who receive appropriate dose and timely applied behavior analysis will have that same result, and that they will go to mainstream in regular education. And today, 20 plus years later, she is pursuing a Master's of Science degree. Seeing this all on one slide looks kind of nice, but there was a lot of blood, sweat, tears, and more tears to get to that point. But I share this with you because it is absolutely possible. And that's why I'm such a big proponent of early intervention and applied behavior analysis, because I've seen myself the benefits it can have. So the topic of our presentation is health insurance coverage for autism spectrum disorder, past, present, and future. And I just kind of wanted to provide a little bit of context as to what I'm talking about. When we're talking about the past for autism insurance coverage, I'm going to discuss that in the context of my family's personal experiences after receiving a diagnosis in 2001, and then my professional advocacy efforts on that front. And then we start talking about the present. We'll review kind of what the status of national coverage is today, what you can do if your plan does not cover medically necessary treatments for autism, and some of the common pain points that many of us are experiencing. And then the future of autism, health insurance for autism. We're going to try to anticipate what some of the health insurance related issues of importance to the autism community are that remain unaddressed. And because we are a relatively small group, please don't hesitate to put questions in as we're going along into the Q&A box. And if I don't address them immediately, we'll be sure to address them at the end of the presentation. But I do think it's important.
Oops, sorry, Mike, before, if you're out on Facebook watching, go ahead and put questions in there and we'll get them asked as well. So thank you.
Perfect. Before we go on, though, I think it's important that we clarify some of the terms that I'm going to be using so that we're kind of all on the same page, including what am I talking about when I say health insurance coverage for autism, specifically what benefits are we talking about? Additionally, I want to make sure that we all understand what we're talking about when I say applied behavior analysis. You know, I've been in this field personally and professionally for over 25 years. So a lot of what I talk about, you know, I don't want to presume that everybody has that same level of understanding. So we'll kind of revisit what I mean by ABA. And then also it's important to talk about the different types of health insurance. I was very naive when I first started on this journey. I didn't have any idea what kind of health insurance plan I had. But when it comes to determining your benefits, and if you don't have the benefits that your child needs, it's important to know what type of plan you have in order to direct your advocacy efforts to make a change. So the first term, health insurance coverage for autism, what do I mean by that? When I talk about health insurance for autism, I'm going to talk about it in the context of the Autism Speaks model insurance reform legislation that was produced at the very beginning of the autism insurance reform movement around 2008. And the benefits that were included in that model legislation included diagnostic services, And then also therapeutic services, including applied behavior analysis, speech therapy, physical therapy, occupational therapy, psychiatric and psychological services, and medication. But for the purposes of tracking the progress of meaningful coverage for autism, at what is the tipping point that says, okay, this state has meaningful coverage for autism? After a lot of internal debate at Autism Speaks, and I was with that team, we determined that the law must require at a minimum coverage for applied behavior analysis. But the caveat to that was that the applied behavior analysis had to be delivered by a qualified provider. It couldn't be just somebody saying, oh, I know how to do ABA, I'm going to do it. It had to be provided by someone who was certified by the National Behavior Analyst Certification Board, which is the oldest, most well-respected entity that accredits individuals who have met certain educational experiential requirements to become a board certified behavior analyst. So again, I mentioned applied behavior analysis several times already in the first 5 minutes of this conversation, but I think it's important to kind of revisit what that is, what we're talking about. If you parse up that phrase, let's take behavior analysis. What's behavior analysis? Well, behavior analysis is basically a science. It's the science of human behavior. It's well established over more than 5-6 decades. But it looks at the science of human behavior in that what causes us as humans to demonstrate any particular given behavior. There are typically causes for every behavior that we manifest, and then there's also consequences of every behavior that we manifest. And that can be manipulated to make effective change in people's behavior, or for that matter, behavior at an organizational level. Applied behavior analysis is just that. It applies the science of human behavior to modify behavior in a variety of settings. What we're here talking about tonight is a setting of treating individuals with autism. So as ABA is used to address the core features of autism, which are communication and social challenges, ABA is highly individualized, and it applies that science of behavior analysis to increase an autistic person's repertoire of productive behaviors. For example, how do they communicate their wants and needs, and decrease behaviors that are interfering with the autistic individual's quality of life. For example, self-injurious behaviors, to name just one. The effectiveness of ABA in addressing the core features of autism is well documented in peer-reviewed literature, and it is the most commonly prescribed evidence-based treatment for autism. And that's why it tends to be kind of a recurring topic in this conversation. The other resource that I would recommend that you take a look at if you need more information on applied behavior analysis is CAS put together a frequently asked questions document that's written specifically for families and caregivers. One of the challenges with applied behavior analysis is that when you're talking to scientists, they want to use a lot of scientific language, and oftentimes when they're telling you what ABA is from the perspective of a behavior analyst, it kind of goes right over your head, my head as a parent. So this document was written particularly with the understanding that the audience is going to be parents and caregivers who don't necessarily have a scientific background or necessarily background in behavioral therapy. The other thing that it addresses, and we'll talk about this a little bit later on in the presentation, are some of the common misperceptions that unfortunately are getting a fair amount of airtime, particularly in social media. Particularly does ABA acknowledge the differences that make a person with autism unique. It refutes the assertion that the goal of ABA is to make a person quote unquote normal, whatever the heck that means. do ABA providers allow clients to make choices, and how does it align with the neurodiversity movement? The QR code on the screen there will take you directly to our website, and you can navigate to that document. Looking at here, you go to our resources about ABA and then facts for consumers. I apologize already. I can tell my voice is already starting to go. I do want to gather a little bit of information as it relates to your familiarity with ABA prior to this presentation. So if you could pull out your phones again and or go to your laptop and answer this next question, and that is, prior to attending this presentation, had you ever heard of applied behavior analysis? And trying to see, looks like 7 people responding. Great. Well, that's exciting that everybody has heard of it. All right. The other thing that we need to talk about before we get into the meat of conversation is that there are several different types of health insurance. And it's very important to know which kind of health insurance plan you have, primarily because each category of health insurance is regulated differently. And what that means to you as a parent or caregiver or professional is that coverage details are determined, and how those coverage details can be changed by the type of plan that you have. It also affects your appeals and complaint processes. So in general, I'm gonna this is kind of a general depiction. It's not specific to a particular state. It's not even specific to a national distribution, but it's on average about right in that about a third of people in the United States are covered by Medicaid, a third are covered by a self-funded health benefit plan, and a third are covered by what is referred to as a fully insured plan. And there are some other types that we'll talk about as we go on, but those are the 3 primary types that I'm going to try to address for you. How can you tell what type of health insurance plan you have? Well, generally, if you're a Medicaid beneficiary, or if you have a family member that is in the military and you have coverage through that and have TRICARE, or if you have a family member that is a federal employee, that's pretty apparent what type of plan you have. But it can be a lot more challenging if you get your insurance through either your employer or your spouse's employer, because it could be either a self-funded or a fully insured plan. This is a slide that I put together a while ago, but it shows just a general explanation of what it means to have a fully insured plan. So Homer Simpson's a consumer, and he works for Mr. Smithers. I think that's his name. And he gets his health insurance through them. Now, Mr. Smithers has gone out and vetted a lot of different plans and health insurance carriers to determine what product he's going to offer to his employees. And then the consumer, the employee, pays their monthly premiums. But at the end of the day, it's not the consumer, nor is it the employer. Rather, it's the health insurance carrier that pays the bulk of the claim when I get sick. So, if I were to get cancer, I pay my deductibles and I pay my premiums, and then I meet my deductibles, and after that, it's taken care of by the health insurance company. Now, before you start feeling sorry for the health insurance carriers, understand that they collect premiums from all of their contracts every day, throughout the year, and not all of them are getting sick. So they're collecting premiums from a lot of healthy people, so they're not hurting for money. But the reason that this relationship is important to understand is because it is the entity that is financially responsible for paying the bulk of your claim that has the decision-making responsibility related to benefits coverage. So in the case of fully insured plans, it's not you, the consumer, it's not Mr. Smithers, the employer, it is the health insurance carrier who has the final say in what plans are covered, what benefits are covered, I'm sorry. But importantly, those plans are subject to state law. So if a state law is passed that says all insurance carriers doing business in the state of Kansas must cover X, Y, and Z, the health insurance plans have to comply. But that's why when it comes to advocacy efforts, when we pass laws in a particular state to require coverage for a particular autism therapy, it only applies to these fully insured plans. It doesn't apply to Medicaid. It doesn't apply to fully insured. Doesn't apply to, self-funded plans. It only applies to that roughly 30% of plans that are fully insured. Similarly, some people may have an individual health insurance plan, meaning that you didn't go through your employer to get the coverage. You went directly to the health insurance carrier, or nowadays you got it through the health insurance marketplace. Those plans are also considered fully insured because it is the health insurance carrier that is fiscally responsible for paying the bulk of your claims. Now, this contrasts to self-funded plans, and in this case, the word self is referring to the employer. So we see self-funded plans, we could just as easily say employer-funded plans. In this case, it's pretty similar from the consumer's perspective or the employer's perspective, in that Homer is getting insurance from Mr. Smithers, but in this case, Mr. Smithers has enough money as his company to pay for their employees' claims directly. And there are a lot of advantages, some disadvantages for an employer to consider self-funding a health benefit plan. But since Mr. Smithers isn't necessarily in the business of administering health insurance, he's in the business of running a nuclear power plant. He doesn't know anything about doing that. So he hires what's referred to as a third-party administrator, which is often the health insurance carrier, to administer the benefits. So he hires a third-party administrator to work with the medical provider. But at the end of the day, in this case, in the case of a self-funded plan, it is the employer, not the carrier, that is financially responsible for paying the bulk of those claims. And so in the case of self-funded plans that are not subject to state law, it is ultimately the responsibility of the employer to determine what benefits are covered. Similarly, though, there is the caveat that self-funded plans are subject to not state law, but federal law. But currently, there is no federal law that requires specific coverage for really any particular benefit in self-funded health benefit plans. So I know this is a little bit boring at this point, but it does kind of set the stage for, I think, some important information that many of us as parents are going to need to know. So the bottom line is, say I work for Mr. Smithers, how am I supposed to know whether he is offering me a fully insured or a self-funded health benefit plan? In the case, if the third-party administrator for this self-funded plan is Blue Cross Blue Shield of Kansas City, and it also happens to be the administrator of this fully insured plan, your health insurance card may look identical. So it's very challenging to know what kind of plan you have. So the best way to figure that out is probably to contact your human resources department, specifically somebody in health benefits administration. Some companies have very large human resources department, and the first person you reach out to may have no clue as it relates to health insurance benefits. So if you do reach out to your human resources department, ask to speak to somebody in benefits administration. Some states, unfortunately, neither Kansas nor Missouri, actually require that the health insurance carrier state specifically on the consumer's insurance card whether it's a fully insured or self-funded plan. But again, Kansas and Missouri don't do that. Sometimes if you pull up the documentation that you are entitled to receive when you first get health insurance through your employer, if you look at what's called either the summary plan description or certificate of coverage, reading through that, there may be some indication as to whether or not it's a self-funded or fully insured plan. And finally, although I put this last because you're probably not likely to get a hold of anybody there, is that the U.S. Department of Labor is the regulatory entity for self-funded health benefit plans. So any company that offers a self-funded health benefit plan is registered with the Department of Labor. If you call them, and they can do a search for your company to see if it's in their database and determine if it's self-funded or not. All right, so now we're going to in a position where we can talk a little bit more sensibly about the past of autism insurance reform for autism. And we're going to go through the progression of the green state map. And I'll talk about that a little bit more, but in short, at Autism Speaks, when a state met that criteria that we talked about, that is, they had passed a mandate that at a minimum required coverage for applied behavior analysis delivered by a qualified professional, and we turned that state green. We will also look at coverage for applied behavior analysis under Medicaid. Particularly, there is a benefit under Medicaid called early periodic screening, diagnostic and treatment, and the PSTT benefit of Medicaid requires that Medicaid beneficiaries receive coverage for any medically necessary treatment to ameliorate their condition. And then we'll also talk about how you can advocate for meaningful coverage if you happen to have a self-funded health benefit plan. So again, I mentioned that I was going to kind of share this history in the context of my personal experiences being the father of a child with autism, but also in my professional capacity as an advocate. So my daughter was diagnosed in 2001. At that time, as I mentioned, there were no states that required coverage for applied behavior analysis, no state that met that green state criteria. But shortly after her diagnosis, Indiana did pass a really quite broad mandate that basically said anything that your doctor prescribes, they have to cover. So obviously that would include applied behavior analysis. That was the very first state of its kind in 2001. The problem was that there were, because it was the first, I think in some other reasons, nobody in Indiana was actually able to access that benefit for like 4 to 6 years, I believe, because of implementation issues. But it definitely was the first and then very important landmark in the autism insurance reform movement. So these next slides, I show the progression of years just to show you that there was a pretty long time between 2001 and before the next state passed. In 2006, and again, this is several years after my daughter was diagnosed, and we were beginning to see kind of, I won't say the light at the end of the tunnel, but I will say we were getting to the point where I could functionally do other things, that I started a nonprofit, wholly volunteer advocacy group here in Kansas called the Kansas Coalition for Autism Legislation in March of 2006. And it was really in response to the fact that I was pretty upset that with the state of affairs, and that you had to be a person of means, you had to be a well-educated person in order for your child to get the care that they needed. And so I sat at my desktop and crafted an email and just sent it to everybody, my contact list, kind of sharing our story, what we had been through with our daughter, the struggles it took to find her services, the struggle it took to pay for her services, and said, I want to do something about this. Are you in? And to my surprise, it took off like wildfire. Within a very short period of time, we had a database of over 1,500 people who said, yes, either I'm impacted personally, or I have a family member who's impacted and I want to help to make this better. The first thing that we did was to coordinate basically some educational opportunities for legislators. So we hosted 4 events across the state, one in Overland Park, one in Wichita, one in Topeka, and one in Dodge. I realize there's a lot more state that wasn't impacted there, but those were the 4 that I could get to quickly. But we invited state legislators to attend and basically get a primer on autism, get a primer on applied behavior analysis, because unless you are directly impacted, you probably have no idea what those terms really mean. So that was the first effort that I made as an advocate per se. That following year, Lori Unum led the successful effort to enact Ryan's Law in South Carolina, and that was the second law that passed that met that criteria to turn green, and that it specifically required coverage for applied behavior analysis. That same year, KCAL had introduced a bill that required formation of an autism task force through the state legislature. It had a variety of charges, but basically it was charged with determining kind of the state of autism here in Kansas, with a focus on insurance coverage. That same year, the Kansas HCPS autism waiver was implemented and actually funded for the first time. And that was actually the first instance of a third-party option to pay for autism services in the state of Kansas. After Lori passed her bill in South Carolina, and remember that at this time, this is very early on when social media and email, for that matter, was starting to catch on. And I think that's one of the reasons why after the bill passed in Indiana in 2001, nobody really knew about it, because there wasn't this social media to kind of share what had happened. Whereas in 2007, when South Carolina passed their bill, social media was becoming more active. There was a lot of drama associated with this bill in that it passed both the House and the Senate, but was vetoed by the governor at the very last minute. And so like in the last hours of the session in 2007, Lori and her team of parent advocates had to push to get that veto overturned, which they did. So that story was highlighted on CNN, and that spread. And so, ultimately, I think that was really kind of the spark that initiated the autism insurance reform movement across the country, because of that kind of confluation of events. Lori put together what she calls the Autism Law Summit. And actually they had one a year before that was just a handful of people, but the second one I found about and attended. And basically what the point of the Autism Law Summit at that time was it was largely parents, some providers, but it was basically Lori sharing what worked for her, how she did it, how she got a bill passed in South Carolina. So that was career changing for me to attend that summit. In 2008, actually, Lori was hired. At the time, she was a practicing attorney with the Department of Justice. But Autism Speaks heard about her efforts there in South Carolina and actually reached out to her and hired her to lead the autism insurance reform movement nationwide. Back in Kansas, KCAL had filed an autism insurance reform bill that ultimately failed. But we actually hosted the third Autism Law Summit here in Kansas City. We invited Lori and her husband, Dan, who was also attorney, and some other invited speakers. And we had about 100 people from across the country attend in Kansas City to, again, kind of brainstorm how we can replicate this effort in other states. That same year, the final report of the Kansas Autism Task Force was filed with the legislature. And again, basically that kind of summarized the state of affairs here in Kansas and the reasons for why health insurance coverage for autism was necessary. At that time, we had increased to 8 total states that had met that bar to turn green. In 2009, the second person on the government affairs team at Autism Speak was hired, Judith Urcity, who is also an autism parent. And back here in Kansas, we filed another autism insurance reform bill that failed yet again. In 2010, Kansas finally got our autism insurance reform bill passed. But as many of you know who may have been part of that process back then, and they refer to lawmaking as kind of sausage making, in that it doesn't, the bill that you file doesn't necessarily look like the law that comes out the other end. And that was certainly the case here in Kansas, and that our initial proposed language applied to all fully insured plans with no age or dollar caps. But what came out at the end was a coverage that it did require coverage for applied behavior analysis, but it was only limited to state employees. There's a provision in state and Kansas legislature that requires any mandate before any mandate extends beyond the state insurance, beyond the state employee health plan, that it go through a 1-year pilot project to determine cost and utilization. So that was one of the reasons why our bill was limited. But at the same year, the folks in Missouri passed their bill, which frankly was much more robust than the one in Kansas at that time. We did since come back in Kansas more than once to expand the coverage. So it is a better bill today than it was in 2010. The following year, I was asked to come on full-time at Autism Speaks in their government affairs department to work alongside Lori and Judith and work on this effort across the country. So I retired from my veterinary practice. And at that year, almost half of the states required coverage for applied behavior analysis. I'm just going to go through here, 2012, 2013. In 2014, when we had 38 states that required coverage in the at least in some fully insured plans, the other development that was really important as it relates to other types of coverage was in Medicaid. I mentioned this EPSDT benefit of Medicaid that requires that any Medicaid beneficiary under the age of 21 be covered for any treatment that is medically necessary to ameliorate their condition. Conveniently, up until about 2011, they failed to apply that to children with autism. As a result of that oversight, there were several lawsuits brought against state Medicaid offices, the most important one being in Florida. There was a couple other cases that found in favor of the plaintiffs, and that Medicaid should be covering medically necessary treatments for autism, including applied behavior analysis under the CPSTT benefit. So CMS, who oversees Medicaid at the federal level, issued a bulletin in 2014, basically reminding state Medicaid directors that this EPSDT mandate also applies to individuals with autism, and they specifically cited applied behavior analysis as an example of an evidence-based therapy. So at that time, in addition to working at the state level on fully insured coverage, Autism Speaks was also working with state Medicaid directors to ensure that they were implementing a meaningful benefit for our kids with autism. In 2015, we were almost there, up to 43. These final couple of years went agonizingly slow, but ultimately, by 2019, Tennessee being the final state to take the leap and require coverage for applied behavior analysis for autism was manifest. I mentioned the EPSDT benefit through Medicaid. This we also had a map for every different thing, but we've got an orange state map as it relates to tracking coverage for applied behavior analysis under Medicaid. This is a bit outdated in that it is a map as of 2018, but showed that pretty quickly, you're looking at between 2014 and 2018, all but a handful of states had implemented a benefit that required coverage for ABA under Medicaid. But again, that's only applying to individuals who are eligible for that EPSDT benefit, which are kids less than 21 years of age. This map has changed since then, and I believe all 50 states now do it. And that doesn't mean that there aren't some issues with implementation. There are, but much progress has been made in that front as well. So what about the self-funded plans? That's that final third of the pie that we've talked about. And as a reminder, self-funded benefit plan design is ultimately determined by the employer. It is not subject to state law, so that, you know, as fantastic as it was that we've got this green state map that's fully green now, that doesn't mean that every person in the United States has coverage for autism. For example, if they have a self-funded health benefit plan that didn't opt to add that coverage. But what that means, since it is the employer that makes the decision as to what benefits are covered, families of those employed by those companies can advocate directly at the level of the company and say, hey, this benefit is important to me, it's important to my family, and here's why. And if you can make a compelling argument for them to add that benefit, you've only got to convince a handful of people at the level of the company as opposed to a couple hundred people in the state legislature. So, you know, in some respects, it's a little bit of an easier lift to advocate for coverage if you happen to be covered by a self-funded health benefit plan. Working with Lori and Judith, when we were still at Autism Speaks, we put together this self-funded employer toolkit. And if you scan that code, it will take you directly to that document as well. But this arms families with some of the basic information about how to go about this process. Who at the company should they reach out to? We provide a template letter that asks for a meeting and why they're asking for that meeting. And, you know, at the time we were in a position to actually join families in meetings to help them advocate to their employers to do that. We're probably not able to do that any longer, but we can certainly counsel families and help them to get this coverage adopted. We actually, there is a survey of a national survey of employer-sponsored health benefit plans put out by a company called Mercer The majority of the plans in that survey are self-funded, and it looks at specific benefits that are being offered by self-funded health benefit plans. This is a document that was published in 2013 and actually looks at the coverage as it was in 2012. We reached out to Mercer to find out exactly what they meant by intensive behavioral therapies, and in effect, what they're meaning there is applied behavior analysis. So in 2013, 36% of self-funded companies responding to the Mercer survey covered applied behavior analysis for autism. We tracked that for several years, but it's a very expensive document, I think in the order of like $6,000, and we're only interested in one page of it. So we kind of had a hard time justifying getting that year after year. So where are we at present? And we talked about the fact that it is exciting that our green state map, which monitors coverage in fully insured plans, is entirely green. But that's a little misleading, not only because it doesn't reflect coverage in self-funded plans or Medicaid, but also because even within fully insured plans, there are some gaps, and in some cases actually caps on coverage. For example, in Kansas, and some other states as well, when the bill was being considered in the state legislatures, the small employer lobby, the chambers of commerce, were very concerned, frankly, unjustifiably so, that by mandating coverage on small companies, that it would raise their premiums to the point where they wouldn't be able to offer health insurance companies to their families anymore. And we actually had data to refute that assertion, but at the end of the day, because of the complaints and concerns raised by advocates for small employers in some states, including Kansas, small group plans were excluded from coverage. And in most states, the definition of a small group plan is one that is offered by an employer with less than 50 employees. So that is problematic here in Kansas and some other states as well. Kansas, as well as some other states, also has imposed age and dollar caps on coverage. There are good arguments that those age and dollar caps are illegal, particularly in consideration of federal mental health parity laws, and in some cases state mental health parity laws, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. The other thing is that we talked about individual plans and marketplace plans, and for those of you who may not be familiar with the term marketplace plans, may be more familiar with the term Obamacare plans. Those are plans that you can directly purchase off the health insurance marketplace. But depending on where you live, what is considered an essential health benefit is different. For example, an essential health benefit in Missouri includes coverage for applied behavior analysis for autism. That's not the case here in Kansas. It's a bit convoluted as to how that came to be. I don't know, we don't really, probably not the platform to discuss that now, but I will say that the Kansas Department of Insurance, particularly Commissioner Vicki Schmidt, is a huge champion for individuals with autism. When she was in the state legislature, she was a champion for this cause. And when she was, and now that she's the Commissioner of Insurance, she is also a huge champion for the cause. The federal government actually offered grants to states to fund third-party assessments of each state's essential health benefit package. So basically, they could apply for a grant to fund, a company to look at what their current offerings are compared to other states, particularly surrounding states, look at the cost impact of any changes to those essential health benefits, and make recommendations. The Kansas Department of Insurance took advantage of that grant, applied, received the funding. A third-party analysis was done, and among the 3 benefits that independent, nonpartisan, third-party study determined were necessary to supplement our essential health benefits was the inclusion of applied behavior analysis for autism. And so the next step was, and the Kansas Department of Insurance as an executive body has the authority to make a change to the state essential health benefit package without going through the state legislature. So the next step was simply for the Kansas Department of Insurance to take that report and say, here's what we want to add, including applied behavior analysis, which would have resolved multiple things here in Kansas. And it would have eliminated the gaps in that small groups would be covered. And it would also have added ABA for autism to our essential health benefits package. So anybody purchasing a plan through the health insurance marketplace would have coverage for autism. Unfortunately, the Kansas legislature intervened and stopped the Department of Insurance from doing that, saying that they wanted to have a say and that it had to go through the legislative process, which was incredibly frustrating. But anyway, that's kind of some of the existing challenges that are here in Kansas, at least. And then there are also challenges in across the board, whether it be in fully insured plans, self-insured plans, self-funded plans, but particularly if there are any TRICARE beneficiaries on the call or Medicaid beneficiaries in states other than Kansas and Missouri, because I really don't think that there are too many issues with implementation of that benefit here locally, but y'all can correct me if I'm wrong. But in some states, for example, in Illinois, although they say, yeah, ABA is required to be covered under the EPSDT benefit here, their definition of qualified providers is such that in order to be reimbursed to deliver ABA to a Medicaid beneficiary in Illinois, you have to not only be a board certified behavior analyst, but you have to be a licensed psychologist. And so basically that limits the pool of qualified providers to about 2 people in the state of Illinois. And so it's that kind of nonsense that we continue to fight against. I don't see any questions coming in so far, Stephanie, so I'm going to keep going. But we're at a point now where I'm talking about some practical questions that I think many families may ask of us. And I'll run this list, and then if there are more, please let me know. But the first question is, how can I as a parent determine what benefits are covered under my health benefit plan? I mentioned to you all before a document called the Summary Plan Description or Certificate of Coverage. Those 2 documents are similar in that they are very detailed and they specifically outline benefits that are covered and benefits that are excluded. And when you sign up for health insurance through your employer, whether it's self-funded or fully insured, you are obligated to receive a copy of your summary plan description. So that's the document where you will find it. There are some other similar documents that provide more of a summary, like summary of benefits. That's not what you want. Because that basically just provides you with categories of covered benefits and the associated deductibles and that sort of thing. It doesn't get into the detail that you need to know whether or not your child is covered for applied behavior analysis. The second question would be, say you investigate your summary plan description and you determine that ABA is not covered for you, whether that be because you have a self-funded health benefit plan whose employer hasn't opted to add that benefit, or if you happen to live in a state whose fully insured plans have some gaps or caps that negatively impact you. But the first thing to do is find out what type of plan it is. Is it self-funded or is it fully insured? And again, the reason that's important is because it affects how you advocate for adding the benefits that your family needs. If it's a self-funded plan, again, the decision maker there is the employer. So you need to reach out to your company administrators and have the conversation. If, on the other hand, it is a fully insured plan, your employer can't do anything about that. They have no say over what benefits are there. That is a case where you would need to look at getting a state law passed. Fortunately, like I said, all 50 states have made inroads in that. But if there are gaps and caps that affect you, please reach out to me, and I can put you in contact with people in a particular state that would help you with that. And then finally, say, what if everything looks great? So yeah, my kid's supposed to be covered for applied behavior analysis. He's receiving applied behavior analysis, but my claims are being denied. What do I do there? Now that more and more providers are accepting insurance, 20 years ago when I was going through this, our providers didn't take insurance. So when I submitted my claims, it was all on me trying to figure out what the heck I was doing, which was basically I didn't know what I was doing, in short. But nowadays, because most providers do accept insurance, I would recommend that you lean on your provider. The providers are going to be the one that are going to be your biggest champion in fighting to get any sort of denials overturned. If that doesn't work, there are a variety of legal resources, both nationally at the state level, that can help you. And I would be happy to share those resources with you if necessary. All right. Okay, great. You've already kind of gone on to the next one here. It looks like I'm going to go ahead and start in case some other people haven't had a chance. But I was very curious because this leads into our next conversation as it relates to present challenges, and that, the people on the call, what are the first three words that come to mind when you hear the term applied behavior analysis? Looks like only 3 people have responded so far. Give it just a couple minutes. And these are all non-identified folks. You've got something not nice to say, you're welcome to say it.
Mike, I'll tell you, when Matthew was diagnosed in 2009, he was 13 years old already. And I remember one of the first parent support groups I found, the first meeting was back behind my house. And I was like, oh, I'm going to go to this. And I heard all about ABA. And I was like, oh, this sounds great. And they're talking about, under the age of 5 and everything. And the first time I said, I'm like, this is all great. How do I find one for a 13-year-old? And I remember at that time, they didn't have people providing services for anybody older, which I know they do now. So that's always great.
Yeah.
But we did not have ABA.
Yeah, and I think, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, Stephanie, when we talk about future challenges, and that a bulk of the conversation around health insurance, unfortunately, has been focused on children. But as all the parents on the call can tell you, autism doesn't go away. You've got a child with autism now, but in 30 years, you're going to have an adult with autism. The challenges are going to be different. Some may be better, some may be worse, but you're always going to have a child with autism, and they may benefit in some cases from, if not applied behavior analysis, some other sort of intervention that will need, that should be covered by your insurance.
It's funny you just like read my Facebook post from the other day, it sounds like, because I absolutely, like, I think it was yesterday or the day before, I posted how, just because my son is now 28 and he graduated from college in December, that doesn't mean he's no longer autistic, or, our challenges are still there, they're just different. Autism does not go away, and I wish people would understand that, and
Absolutely.
legislators.
Absolutely. We've come a long way, but we've got a long way to go.
Yeah.
All right. Well, it looks like now we've got at least 7 folks who have put in some terms, and take a few minutes to read over. There's helpful. I think the bigger they are, the more commonly they've been stated here, but we'll say helpful, individual. Interestingly, PTSD for autistic people. We'll talk about that in a minute. Life change, behavior, work, behavior modification, challenging. That's interesting. Yes, I would say that is challenging. And from my perspective too, and I sound like an old fart now, but 20 years ago, there were no center-based programs locally. I'm here in Olathe. For those of you who don't know, there were no center-based programs, and so all of our ABA programs were in-house. And I would say challenging is an understatement as it relates to coordinating an in-home therapy, particularly when you've got other kids in the house. Okay, well, this was super helpful. Thank you all for responding. The other thing that I think that we need to address head on is that there is a fair amount of anti-ABA rhetoric in the media, particularly social media. I believe that it's a relatively small group, but they are quite vocal group of autistics who are very opposed to ABA. And in many cases, that opposition is not limited to applied behavior analysis, but any suggestion that autism requires any sort of treatment. Not being an autistic person myself, I have spoken to many autistic people about this particular issue. And so my comments are mine. My comments are not necessarily Cass. My comments are Mike Wasmer's. But much of the criticisms around ABA appear to be based on preservation of an autistic person's identity, particularly those individuals. And I personally don't like this term because I think it minimizes the challenges that this portion of the spectrum face. But I don't have a better term for it. That is these higher functioning individuals who, are perhaps the level 1 autistics now under the DSM-5, who, these are individuals who may have been so mildly impaired that they never were either officially diagnosed with autism or may not necessarily have required any sort of intensive therapy. And they see their autism as a strength. And I applaud that. I sincerely do. And I see that in my own daughter, and that, there are definitely strengths that she has, particularly when it comes to focusing on a task and focusing on an interest. She can get stuff done like nobody else. And I recognize that there are strengths in some people as it relates to autism. The other criticisms, though, appear to be based on some false assertions, frankly. The assertion that ABA removes an individual's choice, or the assertion that ABA is torture. And somebody on the call mentioned the possibility that ABA causes PTSD. And then also, many criticisms are based on autistic persons purporting that they had personally had bad experiences with ABA. I don't have an answer for all this. We're going to discuss a little bit more on the next slide, but when we do start discussing it, I think it's super important that we have mutually, and I stress that, mutually respectful dialogue. And the fact of the matter is that a lot of ABA professionals can be defensive about you're attacking their field, but on the other hand, many autistics who are actually pro ABA, but are often afraid to speak up for fear of retribution and bullying by other autistics. And I know for a fact that happens. My own daughter, obviously, she is on the spectrum. She was diagnosed with autistic disorder under the DSM-4, so would have probably been, a level 2, level 3, so pretty severely impaired, and was a beneficiary of applied behavior analysis. And she speaks very highly of applied behavior analysis. She speaks very highly of the therapist, and really enjoyed, didn't have anything negative to say about it. When she went off to college, she wanted to kind of make a clean break of being identified as being on the spectrum, and I had to respect that. So she didn't disclose. But through the first year or two of her college experience, she realized that she was struggling with things that she probably didn't have to struggle with if she had disclosed and asked for help. And she was also at a point where she felt that she wanted to find a community of peers. And whereas she was never really interested in participating in any self-advocate groups up until then, she decided that she would go that route. And very quickly, when she made the mistake of responding to some anti-ABA rhetoric, she was basically bullied out of that group. So here's a young woman who's struggling socially in a new environment, who was reaching out to autistic peers and being bullied out of that group because of her position on ABA. So it does happen, and I think that's a shame. So how do we respond to the criticism of applied behavior analysis? Again, and I've discussed this before, I think it's important that we encourage dialogue and accurate exchange of information. I put up previously the CASP FAQ. I would encourage families to take a look at that. There is also a version for professionals that is written for kind of allied professionals in the field who are working with individuals with autism. But I also think it's super important to acknowledge and validate that there are, in fact, some individuals who have been diagnosed formally with autism, who have had genuinely bad experiences with applied behavior analysis. I think it's important to acknowledge that. I think it's important to validate that. And I think it's important to investigate exactly the details of what happened. Why was it a bad situation? And I think along those lines, it's important to verify, and I didn't put this on here, but first is the person who's sharing this criticism, have they been formally diagnosed with autism? Because I think that there are some folks out there who want to jump on the bandwagon and bashing a particular group of people who may not necessarily even have an official diagnosis of autism. Secondly, did that critic personally experience the incident, or are they sharing secondhand information? Because I think, obviously those who are personally experienced, we're going to want to, consider that a more valid experience than someone who's just sharing secondhand information. And I will give another personal anecdote in that I've got a cousin who's got a 14-year-old son with autism, who was diagnosed early, again, 2-3 years of age, and received several years of applied behavior analysis and benefited from that. He is on social media and found himself on some, anti-ABA websites. And when I went out and spoke with him recently, and his dad was telling me what I do, the first words out of his mouth is that, oh, ABA is torture, and it causes PTSD. And his mom was standing there with me when he said that. And she goes, "You got ABA for 3 years. Did you feel that you were tortured?" And he said, "Oh, no." But it just goes to show that, this is a vulnerable population, and they are subject to some of this anti-ABA rhetoric and, buy into it without even recognizing that they themselves were a beneficiary of the service. The other thing that I think is important is when you're speaking to someone who has reported to have a bad experience, is to find out whether or not the provider that delivered the services was a qualified provider. That is, were they a board certified behavior analyst in good standing with the BACB, which is the national credentialing body for individual ABA providers. Because unfortunately, until all states have licensure for applied behavior analysis, and most do now, I say most, I think probably 35, 36 states require licensure for autism, for behavior analyst. But until all 50 states do have that licensure, there is the possibility that someone could go out there and hang their shingle saying, "I'm a behavior analyst," and treat kids, but not actually be a qualified professional. And that is, that whole regulatory issue is something that we are definitely working on to make sure that, all states have state licensure to do that. Although the BACB is the entity that credentials these individual providers, and they do have a very strict code of ethics that their credential leads must abide by. They don't have any jurisdiction over somebody who is out there saying that they can do behavior analysis. The only thing that they can come down on is if there is a behavior analyst who is in fact certified by that body who is doing something unethical. They can strip their credential, but they don't have any jurisdiction over somebody who isn't one of their own credentialees. So the other thing that I would ask, if I were in a conversation with somebody about criticisms of ABA, is whether or not that critic appreciates the full spectrum of severity within the diagnosis of autism. I have many friends whose children are very profoundly affected, may have comorbid intellectual disabilities. In fact, more than 30% of individuals diagnosed with autism are in that profound autism category. That lived experience of an individual who has profound autism in their family is not the same lived experience as somebody on the other end of the spectrum, who may never received any intensive therapy or therapy at all and is able to function independently. So does that person have the theory of mind to appreciate the lived experiences of somebody at the other end of the spectrum, in that we're certainly not trying to change that person's identity. We're trying to give that person the skills to live to the extent possible, live independently, and not subjecting themselves to self-harm. The other thing that I would ask is whether or not the references that critics are citing that purport to show adverse effects, for example, the PTSD issue, whether those citations have withstood scrutiny by the scientific community, and as it relate there, the whole idea of this ABA causing PTSD came from a single article that has since been publicly refuted in the scientific community as not being a valid study.
Mike, before we go on, I just want to also encourage parents, and I do this on phone calls and with parents right after the initial diagnosis, is pay attention, go with your gut, have those frank conversations with the BCBA that you are hiring to provide ABA with your child. Make sure they understand, your concerns and all of this so that they can answer those questions for you. And then, pay attention. If you're having it in home-based services, you're there. You can see what's happening with your child. Are they being tortured? Are they being, misused or being made to change who they are? Then it's 100% your right to just discontinue ABA services. So, those people who want to just say adamantly, no, I'm not going to because of what I've heard, give it a try. See what happens. That's what I encourage families to do.
Yeah, I would agree, Stephanie. Thank you. Along these lines, there was an incident. I won't say an incident. In the summer, early this summer, the American Medical Association House of Delegates were presented with a draft resolution that was submitted by an anti-ABA student group. The title of that draft resolution was Removal of AMA Support for Applied Behavior Analysis. The upshot of this whole event was misinterpreted by some folks and claimed that the AMA removed their support for applied behavior analysis. That was not the case. There were several problems with this draft resolution, and that it included largely anecdotal reports, or the references that were cited had been refuted in the scientific community. But the AMA, in their consideration of that draft proposal, rejected the proposed title. If you look at the title, it's like, yeah, that's horrible. But the AMA expressly rejected that title and adopted a modified resolution with the title Standardizing Coverage for Evidence-Based Treatments for Neurodivergent Individuals. The intent of the change in the title and the subsequent details of the resolution itself were twofold. One, the AMA wanted to allow for coverage of evidence-based treatments for other neurodivergent conditions in addition to autism. That's why they took autism out of the title of the resolution and changed it to neurodivergent individuals. Secondly, they wanted to be inclusive of practices beyond applied behavior analysis. Forward thinking that, what if 20 years down the road, there's another evidence-based therapy that's better than applied behavior analysis? They want to leave that door open to endorse those evidence-based therapies. So they did remove specific reference to applied behavior analysis, but they removed specific reference to any specific therapy. The resolution simply says that they endorse evidence-based practices for autism. But unless you look at the details of what actually transpired in the conversations within the AMA, this information, what the upshot was that it was being misinterpreted. And in fact, the AMA has already expressly acknowledged that ABA is an evidence-based service to treat the core features of autism when they approved CPT codes for adaptive behavioral therapy back in 2019. Prior to 2019, there were no specific CPT codes For those of you not familiar with it, those are the codes that are used when a provider delivers a service and needs to get paid for it. They have to use particular codes. If there is no particular code for that service, they're not going to get paid for it. The criteria that the AMA sets to establish the validity of a service before they approve what's called a category 1, which are permanent CPT codes, is exceedingly high. So the AMA already acknowledged that ABA is an evidence-based therapy back in 2019 when they adopted those codes. And if you want to see CASP's response to that situation, you can scan the QR code there. So now we move on to future considerations. A couple states, including California and I believe Illinois, have passed laws that require the payers, those are the insurance carriers, to use generally accepted standards of care when they are making their benefit determinations. This all came about from a lawsuit in California where an individual was denied coverage for substance abuse disorder, but the payer had relied on internal standards of care. Basically, they drafted the standards of care themselves, and ultimately the individual passed away because he didn't get the care that was necessary. So the state of California passed a law that requires all funders to use generally accepted standards of care that are authored by a nonprofit, the leading nonprofit entity within the field. And so, again, California did that, Illinois did that, but we are looking to replicate that effort in all 50 states as well. I think I mentioned before, some of the age and dollar caps that are persistent in some of the state laws are likely in violation of state and or federal mental health parity. There is definitely a movement afoot to more aggressively enforce those laws. So hopefully we'll see some of those gaps and caps deteriorating. We also, applied behavior analysis, as you all know, one of the core features of that is that we want the behaviors to be able to be replicated in multiple settings, not just within the clinic or not just within the home. You want to see those behaviors extend out into the community. And therefore, the services that are provided must be provided within the community as well. In some cases, carriers are denying coverage for applied behavior analysis if it's being delivered in a school setting. Those are challenges that we continue to work on as well. And as Stephanie alluded to earlier, autism doesn't end at 21. And so we do need to look at making sure that there is meaningful coverage for adults on the spectrum. And then the other thing that's come up very recently is, you can't bat an eye without seeing somebody purporting the benefits of using artificial intelligence, whether that's, some generative AI like ChatGPT or, some other type of AI application. But what we're finding is that some payers are actually now incorporating artificial intelligence as it relates to decisions for your healthcare. So if you submit a claim that might first go through an AI application before it gets to a human eyes, if at all. So one of the things that we've been talking about within CASP recently is whether or not, to what extent is that a problem? And if we do find that it is a problem, is that something that we need to legislate to make sure that there is at least a set of human eyes on your case before a final decision is made? It looks like we're doing right at 7:20.
Yeah. We did have a question off Facebook. Have a family member who had their child in ABA for 3 years and got good outcome, but took him out of ABA saying their child turned to a robot sounding like his therapist. My question is, when is too much? Is there such a thing?
That is a great question. I would say that all ABA treatment programs must include some sort of a transition plan, and that is a transition from going from, the intensive therapy that you might have gotten early on to weaning them off. And then there may be cases where down the road, as the child, particularly as they go through puberty or any transition for that matter, whether transition from high school to beyond high school, or any sort of life change that may cause new behaviors to arise that need to be addressed, where they might need some degree of applied behavior analysis. But to answer the question about whether there could be too much ABA, I guess the short answer is probably. But I would say too much in the terms that it's too much for the individual and or their family to manage. And we were prescribed 30 hours a week of a home-based therapy, and there were times where I felt like, okay, this is so disruptive to our family that I don't know that we can do it much longer. But I don't think that quote unquote too much ABA therapy is necessarily the cause for any sort of robotic tenor to a child's speech. I think a lot of individuals with autism tend to have that kind of stilted speech.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and that's what my suggestion was going to be: is take a break for a little bit, if that's what you think, and wait and see if the child does need, you feel like your child needs more at different parts of the transition, then go ahead and seek it out again. So I don't see any other questions. Does anybody on Zoom have any questions? Feel free to unmute yourself and ask if you would like. I know there's been some questions.
My contact information up there. You're welcome to reach out to me directly. That's my cell phone. If there are questions, I'll do my best to respond. As a fellow parent, I've been there. Obviously, everybody's journey is a little bit different, but yes. If there's something that I could share with another family, I'd be happy to.
Well, I want to thank you for your time tonight, Mike. This was great information to hear about what's in the past and what they can do now and in the future. So I appreciate you joining us tonight. For those of you on the call and on Facebook land, next month our topic is going to be on ADHD. So that information will come out soon for you all. Feel free to sign up and join us again. We really appreciate you. And if there's ever a topic you'd like to hear more information on, feel free to email me. My email address, I will put it out there on Facebook, and I know on Zoom they already have it. So thanks everyone. Have a great night and enjoy the cooler weather that we're having here in Kansas, and have a great weekend.
So